All right, welcome everyone. We're going to give others just a minute or two here to join our webinar, and then we will go ahead and get started. All right, good morning. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to Keystone Species Supporting Homegrown National Park. My name is Jamie Heflin, and I'm here with a few housekeeping notes before I hand the reins over to Shannon and Nikki. This is a webinar, so your camera and microphone are muted. If you have a question, you can type it into the Q&A box. Nikki and Shannon will be answering questions throughout the webinar. However, some questions may be held over until the very end, so stick around. We do value your feedback. We have a couple of quick anonymous poll questions to get your input. And there will be a survey at the end of the webinar as well that you should receive at the very end. I will also be providing a plant list of all of the plants that we have discussed today. That should be coming to you via email following the webinar. This webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our YouTube channel in the next few weeks. Now I'm going to introduce our presenters. As Vice President of Sales and Marketing at Midwest Ground Covers, Nikki oversees the strategy and tactical development of the sales, marketing, and shipping logistics teams. She is heavily involved in company-wide strategic planning and goal setting. Nikki also sits on the Illinois Landscape Contractors Association's Board of Directors. Shannon McInerney is product manager here at Midwest Ground Covers, where she oversees purchasing and is responsible for product line development in the plant accession and trial process. She also coordinates work in the Midwest Gardens. Beside her work at Midwest, Shannon is a member of the Perennial Plant Association Board of Directors, the College of DuPage Hort Advisory Board, and the ILCA Awards Committee. Nikki and Shannon have shared their extensive plant knowledge in many past webinars, at industry events, and at trade shows. If you'll be attending education at the iLandscape Show next week, you can catch Shannon at 2 panel sessions. On Wednesday, she'll share the stage for the session titled Managing the Message with Native Plants. And on Thursday, she'll participate in TLC series Growing Great Grasses. Now, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off with a quick poll just to see who among you are familiar with Homegrown National Park, and then I will hand the reins over to Nikki.
All right. So it looks like we have a few of you that are maybe a little familiar with Homegrown National Park and half of you that aren't. So we're hoping you get a little bit of new information today. Homegrown National Park is a really, really cool initiative. It was started by Doug Talamay, who is a professor at the University of Delaware. He focuses on entomology, which is pretty cool. And he's also written quite a few books. So I would highly recommend after this webinar to check out some of his works. Bringing Nature Home is my personal favorite. He also has a lot of information on YouTube, and he's done some webinars through like American Beauty is Native Plants to talk about cultivars and how pollinators, interact with cultivar plants, which we're not going to talk about that today, but just a lot of really good information on how pollinators use plants. So, and I really like this quote from Doug Tallamy to talk about why Homegrown National Park. So, our national parks, no matter how grand in scale, are too small and separated from one another to preserve native species to the level needed. Thus, the concept for Homegrown National Park, a bottom-up call to action to restore habitat where we live and work, and to a lesser extent where we farm and graze, extending national parks to our yards and communities. So the whole idea is, especially insects, they need a path to travel and they need connected natural areas. And right now, with so much development, these natural areas really aren't connected. So it's a really fun way. It's a grassroots movement to get people excited to have native plants in their yard. If you guys out there watching today are landscape contractors or designers, it's a really fun way to engage your customers to get them excited about native plants. So hopefully today you'll take some talking points away that you can share with others. So a little bit about Homegrown National Park, some statistics that I think are pretty cool. Make sure to give them a follow on social media. They already have 250,000 followers across all social media platforms. So there's definitely an interest there, definitely people who want to know more about Homegrown National Parks. And they already have a biodiversity map on their website, which you guys can go and check that out, where they already have over 100,000 acres from 40,000 people documented as homegrown national parks. So really cool, really great program to get people involved with, getting on the map, getting native plants in their backyards. If you guys are new to native plants too, their resource directory is pretty outstanding. They have over 600 resources on their website. So again, if you're trying to learn more about natives or in your state, if you're not in Illinois, they have state-specific resources as well. So again, just a really, really great program. So we'll move to the next slide, which we're going to talk a little bit. Oh, we have a poll. I forgot. Sorry. So Keystone species, that's what we're going to talk about next. Do you feel confident you can relay to your customers the importance integrating Keystone species into their gardens and projects? So Keystone species may be a brand new word for you. So maybe we need to dig in more today. Maybe you already know what a Keystone species is. So what level of understanding are we at right now? Personally, it was a new concept to me when I kind of dove into the Homegrown National Park movement. Okay, cool. 50-50 again. I love this. And I love that we have people on here that know about Homegrown National Parks and Keystone species. So, keystone species are the most productive plants that support the largest number of species. When we're talking about species, of course, majority of that is more insect related. They form the backbone of our local ecosystem. So they're the plants that really support making our environments healthy, making sure that our insect populations, which are so critical, are healthy as well. And they're the most diverse. Even the most diverse gardens will have gaps in their food web without at least one keystone species. So if in this presentation today, you can just pick one or two that you're going to start integrating into your designs or introducing your clients to or suggesting to folks that you know, that'll have a huge benefit. So insects, why are they beneficial and why are they important? And this needs a lot of education because I can't tell you how many times I go out and visit landscape contractors and their customers are asking for sterile environments. They don't want plants that attract any insects. And it's like, oh my gosh, like I get it. Plants make, the landscape beautiful, but we do have to do a lot of education to really help our customers and our folks out there understand why insects are important. So they play a vital role in maintaining healthy ecosystems. They act as pollinators, decomposers, and they're a food source for a lot of other animals. I think a way to tug at people's heartstrings is birds raise their young almost entirely on soft-bodied insects, especially caterpillars. So it's really important that we integrate plants into our landscape that focus on supporting insects. Um, Bees, especially, are essential for reproduction of plants, so food crops too. Bees are critical and we have to support them. Insects help decompose organic matter, recycling nutrients back into the soil. That's, of course, healthy soil is the foundation of having a healthy landscape. So we need insects as well. And then by supporting insect populations through native plantings, we sustain the entire food web and promote ecological balance. So really important. A couple other things I want to go over. Just to talk about keystone plants. So we're going to talk about how plants feed insects, and you might hear the word nectar or pollen. Both are good. Insects need both. Nectar is more of a sugary liquid substance that feeds the insects and gives them energy like right away, where pollen they tend to collect, and we've seen pictures of that. Pollen is more protein heavy, and they take that back to their hives, and pollen is what is fed to the larval. So both really important. Also, both the pollen's important for plant reproduction. So of course, we want the bees to pick that up to feed the baby bees. And then we want that for plant reproduction as well. So, oh, and the last thing I want to mention is you are going to see a lot of yellow plants today. So I think when Shannon and I embarked on this journey to create this webinar, we're like, wow, this is like majority yellow plants, and then you'll see some purple plants at the end. And why that is because of the way bees see. So the way they pick up UV, the UV spectrum is different. So they're more attracted to plants that are yellow and actually blue. And there was a really cool New York Times article, again, Google it, that actually shows how bees see flowers. And when they see a yellow flower, it is definitely brighter and usually pulls the bee in to pollinate and feed. So again, you're going to see a lot of yellow today, a little bit of purple, but wanted to give you a little information on why. So with that, Shannon's going to talk about ecoregions.
Yes, so an important or kind of how the breakdown for the keystone plants works is by ecoregion. So an ecoregion is an area that shares, it's, I guess, a better definition than lots of times we break things down by states or, some other kind of geographic lines. But we know that Illinois, the southern Illinois to northern Illinois can be different. Big states like California or Texas obviously have lots of different kind of areas within them. So an ecoregion is grouping things by more common ecosystem characteristics. So we have a few listed there like weather, exposure, wildlife. Some others are vegetation, land use is a big one. So, kind of grouping some of the states that are big agriculturally or for grazing, those are kind of grouped as each ecoregions, as well as hydrology. So kind of grouping things more by environmental ways than just by some boundaries that have been put in place because, that latitude line made sense or something like that. So going into the next slide, level 1 ecoregion. So this is kind of the grand scale of the top level breakdown here. So in North America, we have 15 ecoregions. So, from all the way down to Central America or Mexico to up into Canada. And so the ones in the red boxes are what we are going to be more specifically talking about today. And I did want to preface this too. Homegrown National Park had a really great webinar last week. I'm not sure if anyone on here attended it, but Doug Ptolemy was one of the panelists, along with Rebecca McMacken and Benjamin Vogt. And they had, I think they said, about 1,000 people on it. So we are, reaching a lot more people with their message. But they did have some really great resources about ecoregions. So this information is available on the US EPA website, but there's also a website called bplant.org that has information, and you can kind of click into these more. So if you're interested on kind of the characteristics of certain ecoregions in more detail, that's where you can find it. I'm going to kind of give a high level overview here. So, so you see that area shaded green where, Illinois, Indiana, southern Wisconsin is. That is the 8.0 ecoregion, so the eastern temperate forest. So actually the bulk of the country's population is within this ecoregion. So thinking about, more populous areas, more populous cities, they are in the eastern temperate forest area. So some characteristics of that are well-defined seasons for the most part. I know we have jokes about how we have 13 seasons in 6 weeks in this time of year, but more well-defined 4 seasons. Generally, precipitation is rather equally distributed throughout the year, as opposed to places in the West Coast where they have, Oregon has a very dry season in summer and then a wet season in winter. Generally, biodiversity is high. So those are some characteristics for the eastern temperate forest. Today, we're also going to touch on the Great Plains, so the 9.0, that region kind of in the beige color, particularly kind of to hit, some of our Iowa customer base. So that region is typically drier than the eastern temperate forest and has more periods of drought. Otherwise, it is similar in kind of the more well-defined seasons. And then up north of Illinois, northern Wisconsin, northern Minnesota, some parts of Michigan, we have the northern forest, so 5.0. So that area has less of a dry season than as opposed to the Great Plains, where it's typically pretty consistently wet all around. And that's also the area where we're going to start seeing the transition. That is more of the northern coniferous forests, whereas we get south into the green area, Illinois, Indiana, and below, we have the southern hardwood forest. So that's kind of where that line is falling right there. So then if we go to the next slide, the next breakdown is level 2 ecoregions. So that's defining things more in between each high level ecoregion. So there are 50 level 2 ecoregions in North America. Today, we are going to touch on 6 of them. And so, where Midwest Ground Covers is, we're right in the top middle there in the 8.2, the central US plains. So there are similarities in a lot of the keystone plants between these. So you can kind of see those little charts again. That website was bplant.org if you want to look at anything more specifically, if you're outside of the Chicago area here. But if you flip to the next slide, Jamie. So we are going to kind of cover a range of plants today. Not everything is necessarily going to center on that 8.2 central US plains. There will be some plants that we talk about that are, maybe only in 9.2 or only in 5.2 that, we're going to focus on plants that we carry, but also plants that are native to kind of the greater Midwest as a whole. So just because something is a keystone plant, maybe an 8.2, doesn't mean that's not going to be still a good plant to use in another region, that we're discussing today. So a lot of these plants go across multiple of the level 2 ecoregions. And a lot, like I said, a lot of them are native outside of just where they're keystone plants. So they're going to be the most beneficial or most critical, I guess, in where they're listed as a keystone plant, but they'll still be a great plant in a lot of these other areas. So what we see here is kind of a snapshot from the Homegrown National Park website. So they have the ecoregions listed as well. And if you click on that little tile box on the left, this is what will pull up. And so they have plants broken down into two different lists: container gardening keystone plants and trees and shrubs keystone plants. So today we're going to be specifically focusing on the container gardening lists. As that is, primarily what we carry. And so that's going to be flowering forbs. So as Nikki mentioned, we're going to talk about a lot of yellow today. But the reason they call it a container garden list rather than maybe a forb list or a perennial list is because for people who don't have land, who don't, maybe live in an apartment or something like that, these are still plants that would be great in containers. And that, again, going back to that original message, that kind of the quote Nikki said, the really important part of Homegrown National Park is we need to create a fabric across the country for pollinators. So with the more kind of small pockets we have for these pollinators to come and visit and land and kind of to connect all of us is super important. So even if you're in, a couple miles from a park in Chicago, the more people we can have with containers on their balconies with some of the keystone plants, the more we're doing for our pollinator populations. So that's why it's called a container gardening list. So one of the recommendations they have is, because a lot of these are prairie plants with bigger root systems, the bigger and deeper container that you can have, the better. But overall, it's just trying to create this fabric of connections for our pollinators. So with that, I think we are going to get into the plant list. Oh, yes, we have another poll. Have you had customers asking about integrating keystone plants into their projects?
Great. Not too many yet, but maybe after some education today and education you guys do with your customers. All right, so now the fun part, we're gonna talk about individual plants, which is exciting. So the first plant we have is Coreopsis lanceolata, or sand Coreopsis. So like the name kind of tells us, this plant is going to like finer, loamier, sandier soils, and likes to be on the drier side. So this one's not going to do very well if you have wetter, heavier soils. If you plant this one in clay, it's probably not going to overwinter. So just be aware of that. What's really nice about this plant is it's very compact. So this one, if you're looking for like a residential plant that you could integrate into your designs, this one would be great. You could sub this one out for some of the cultivars that are out there. It does tend to seed around a little bit. So if you see the seeding being a little heavy, you can deadhead it. Deadheading it also promotes additional flowering, so you can extend that flowering season. But if you don't, birds actually love the seeds on this plant as well. So also good to leave the seeds because the birds may eat a lot of them. Let's see here. This one is not deer resistant, so you will see some browsing, which is okay. We're talking today about supporting the ecosystem, so we have to feed all of our native fauna, which deer are included in that. This plant has a very special value to native bees, so it attracts over 22 species of native bees. And it actually, Coreopsis has a specialty bee that actually comes and pollinates it. It's the Coreopsis longhorn bee, so it really only pollinates on Coreopsis. So that's why it's important that we integrate these plants into the landscape. It's also the host of the wavy-lined emerald moth, and in general, moths and butterflies also use this plant. So really great compact plant for more residential landscapes and a very, very powerful pollinator plant. So Coreopsis lanceolata.
So then next up, we have Coreopsis palmata. So as compared to Lanceolata, this is going to be more deeply lobed in the foliage, a little bit shorter leaves than Lanceolata, still not as fine-leaved as maybe verticillata and some of those types of Coreopsis, but a little bit, more compact foliage than Lanceolata. It's also going to get a little bit taller at 24 to 36 inches. So this plant likes it dry. It is going to do best in kind of a dry, full sun area, so a more gravelly or loamy soil. If you have it in a bit more shade, it will kind of start to sprawl on you. Also, kind of with that dryness, it tolerates heat and humidity and drought quite well. So this is going to spread by rhizomes or seed. So particularly if it is spreading by rhizomes, you'll get it to form some nice colonies out of that. It's often found in high quality natural areas. So this kind of in the location standpoint, it occurs in most Illinois counties. It's a little more rare in the southeast. You can see from that ecoregion, it is primarily the central US plains, so not as wide of a keystone plant as some of the others that we'll talk about. But it's found in a lot of areas of Illinois, Missouri, southern Minnesota, so kind of Illinois into the west a little bit. So then for the pollinators, it also attracts a variety of native bees. And one other great website, I think we're going to try to, mention a lot of our sources here today, just because, we are still, gathering information on this, and there's a lot more to be had than what we're going to share today. But Nikki mentioned the resources on Homegrown National Park, and one that they used to highlight a bit more was the National Wildlife Federation Plant Finder. That is really great. You can punch in your area code and it'll show you kind of like the top plants for your area based on how many species they help support. How many pollinator species they help support. The plants kind of go by genus, so we're not getting into really species specific support. But still a great website. So Coreopsis palmata supports a variety of native bees. The digger bee is a specialist pollinator on this plant, but it also supports carpenter bees, leafcutter bees, cuckoo bees, wasps, flies, and moths. Sulfur butterflies. It's a good nectar plant for monarchs, so that's always an important one. And then, as Nikki mentioned, we're supporting other animals or mammals too. So the rabbits, groundhogs, and deer do occasionally browse the foliage on this one. Back on the pollinators, they are attracted to both the nectar and the pollen of the flower heads due to the both abundance and accessibility. So that is Coreopsis palmata.
All right, next one is Euthalmia graminifolia, or the grass-leaved goldenrod. So one thing you're going to see here is it does have the common name of goldenrod, but the genus has actually not Solidago. So this one was reclassified pretty recently, within the last maybe 10 years. And actually, it's not a true goldenrod, even though it's in the common name, which is why common names can be confusing and not always accurate. But it has a different flower structure, and a different DNA pattern, which is why they reclassified it. So Solidago, I feel like, can have a little bit of a negative connotation with people. Most people think of Canadian Solidago, which is extremely aggressive. This plant is way less aggressive than that goldenrod, but still actually can be a little bit more aggressive than other plants. So this plant does thrive in moist, sunny locations. So if you have a wet, sunny location, it will thrive and it will kind of take over. So, but you can plant it in a bit of a drier location and it'll keep it more in check, or plant it in a little bit of shade and that will also keep it more in check. Tends to spread by rhizomes. So again, if it's really happy, it'll be spreading more. If you put it in a little bit more of a stressful location, the plant again will stay a little bit more compact. This one also is not deer or rabbit resistant. That is going to be a theme here today. Again, native plants are more delicious to our local fauna. So again, the idea is we plant lots of things in our gardens, so there's lots of things to munch on and pollinate, and that's okay. That's part of having a native landscape. So this one also is a special value to pollinators, especially bees. It's well suited for long tongue and short tongue bees. So have to keep that in mind as well with its flowers. And cool kind of fact about this one, it also attracts 2 native beetles, and it's the main food source for 2 native beetles, the goldenrod soldier beetle and the black blister beetle. So beetles need plants to feed on as well. So this one, Euphamia graminifolia, or the grass-leaved goldenrod.
All right, so before we get to our next plant, we did have a question about perennials overwintering in a container on the balcony. In most cases, I would say I think all of these plant, so typically like the container overwintering garden guidance is you want something that's like a zone hardier than the location you're in because it's outside, above the ground. So most of these plants are pretty hardy that I think they're going to be okay in a container. I mean, anytime you can kind of maybe push it in the corner and give it a little bit protection, maybe cover it with a light layer of compost or something like that could be helpful. But in most cases, I think that these plants would be fine overwintering in a container. So good question. So then our next plant we have is Helenium autumnale or sneezeweed. So I think one other resource we used quite a bit to prepare is Illinois wildflowers, and the majority of the plants we are talking about today are kind of classified as prairie plants. So typically like it sunny, a little bit drier to kind of moist, well drained. So this is one plant that they actually kind of have in their wetland section, as it does prefer, to be in kind of a wetter soil. It can tolerate occasional flooding. It does okay in clay soil. So this is one more where it's not going to look as nice if it's allowed to dry out. So if you have a spot that's more consistently wet, this is a good plant, and you can see it kind of covers quite a range of the different ecoregions we're talking about today, just kind of serving that wetter soil purpose there. So Mount Cuba did a trial on Helenium several years ago, I think about 6 or 7 years ago now, 2017 or 2018, more than that, I think. And the straight species Helenium autumnale, was the most visited of any of the species or cultivars they had there. So a great pollinator plant. Tons of different things are using it. So it has a couple specialist bees, a leafcutter bee, and 2 different genus of longhorn bees. I am not going to be trying to say the Latin names of any bees today because I'm going to focus on getting the Latin names of the plants right. So then it also has some different butterflies. So the dainty sulfur butterfly, the Aster borer, the white dotted groundling, the Duke skipper are all are using this plant for food sources, as well as many different wasp flies, beetles. A lot of them will use the nectar, although some will use some of the bees and beetles will use the pollen as well. So in terms of our mammal friends, they more likely will avoid this plant. So deer tend to avoid it, as the foliage can be more toxic and bitter. I've read a little bit about like livestock, making them sick eating this plant. So if you are in an area with deer, I know that's always a concern in our webinars. So this would be a great plant to try out. Again, a lot of pollinators visiting this plant. One source I came across on this plant in particular is there is a book, Northern Gardener's Guide to Native Plants and Pollinators. It's by Lorraine Johnson and Sheila Kalla. So again, if you are looking after this webinar to dig deeper into information, that's another great source as well. But so this great kind of more wet native plant is Helenium autumnale.
All right, next plant should look kind of familiar, Rudbeckia fulgida, variation fulgida, or black-eyed Susan. So this is actually a great plant if you use Goldstrom and you want, again, to integrate a Keystone plant. This is an easy swap. The plant's going to be similar in height, maybe a little bit taller, but just as floriferous. And actually, we do see some better disease resistant on some of these native Rudbeckias than some of the overused cultivars. So again, really easy swap if you're trying to, encourage your customers to potentially use natives or they're asking about that. This one's also gonna like pretty general garden soil, moist, well drained. It can handle some shade. It is marked as full sun. It can handle a little bit of shade. You just may see that flower count decrease just a little bit, but not too much, and won't see too much flopping either. Again, not full shade, but some maybe part shade would be fine. This plant is also drought tolerant and can handle some clay, so tends to do okay in those soil conditions, which we see a lot here in Illinois. And then the other thing with this one is it's a later season flowering plant and it flowers for a very substantial amount of time. So the flowering on this black-eyed Susan is actually about 6 weeks longer than Rudbeckia Goldstrom. So again, pollinator powerhouse plants because it gives us a very extended feeding season. And that late season feeding is very important. There's obviously less flowers in the landscape, so bees, butterflies, moths need, a pollen and nectar source later into the year. So this plant is also the larval host to the silvery checker spot, and it is just a plant that attracts a lot of bees and butterflies. So again, this one I think is just so easy to maybe integrate into your plant palette and swap out for a native variety versus a cultivated variety. So Rudbeckia fulgida, variation fulgida, black-eyed Susan.
Nikki, we have a question on how is the cultivar Goldstrom different from the straight species? Is Goldstrom sterile?
I don't know if Goldstrom is sterile.
Yeah, I can't say I know for sure, although I mean, you don't really hear often, Goldstrom's more typically spreading by, roots and rhizomes than by seed.
Yeah.
I think Goldstrom is, well, you can buy seed for Goldstrom too. So I guess it is not sterile. That Goldstrom's just a selection that was for better kind of larger flowers. But I think most people are becoming familiar that it has its problems too with black spot and things like that. So
yeah, I think in any of the seminars that I've heard them talk about the native Rudbeckia versus Goldstrom, especially like fulgida, is the disease resistance and the lengthened flower time. So they do average about 6 weeks longer flower time. The singular plant won't have as many flower heads as Goldstrom, but it still has a significant amount and a much longer flowering time. So.
And then we have another question. Will plants still be beneficial if planted in an ecoregion that they aren't listed for? So yes, while different areas, maybe the plants are chosen as keystones because those are the more critical to those regions. Generally, all the plants we're talking about today are great pollinator plants that are going to, be helpful to our pollinator ecosystem. So,
Yep.
Okay, so moving on to another Rudbeckia, we have Rudbeckia hirta. And so this is actually a, we said we were talking about perennials. This is a biennial or a short-lived perennial, um, although it's somewhat of a inconsistent biennial. So it just seems to kind of do its own thing. And it does produce seed, which is most typically how it reproduces. So this is one that I would not necessarily plant it in your landscape and expect it to stay in the same place. It's going to kind of move around. So, it's probably better set in like a more naturalistic style landscape where it can kind of pop up here and there, than something where you want things like really specifically placed. So just a heads up on that. So this is one that also likes full sun, dry soil. It can take some moisture to more moderately dry as well, as opposed to some things, like when we talked about some of the Coreopsis, they really like often the more rocky, gravelly, sandy soils. This is going to want more reasonably fertile soil. So it is good in a more, maybe typical garden setting where some of those other plants, being too fertile might not work as well for them. So you can see this spans all of the ecoregions that we're focusing on today. So an important plant, widely spread. And it also supports a wide range of bees and flies. So little carpenter bees, leafcutter bees, halictine bees, seraphied bees, and then tassinid flies. In moths, the silvery and gorgon checker spot it is a host plant for those. So it feeds on the leaves. Monarchs use this for a nectar source as well. And this is another one that mammals aren't typically too fond of because the leaves are so coarse and kind of hairy and stiff. So it's not as tender and maybe easy to chew as some other plants. This is one that the goldfinch may eat the seeds. The seeds are a little bit small, so it's not always their top preferred, but they will eat this one as well. So this was Rudbeckia hirta.
We had a question that do cultivars like Viet's Little Susie attract any pollinators? Yes, cultivars do tend to attract pollinators if the flower color and flower structure are not bred to change too much. I highly recommend you guys go on YouTube and find the webinar that Doug Talmay talks about varieties or cultivars versus straight species. Straight species tend to be more beneficial, but Mount Cuba's done, trials where cultivars or usually natural selections tend to perform better than the actual straight species. Not in all cases, but sometimes. So it's really important to do your research and understand. But again, native plants support more than just pollinators. So we want to make sure that we're integrating straight species in as much as possible.
Yeah, they did touch on that. Doug Talmay touched on that a little bit in the panel discussion a couple of weeks ago. And the two main things that you really want to avoid, he said, are double flowers. So like the double echinacea, they look really cool, but you've basically gotten rid of anything useful to the pollinators. So double flowers are not good. And then plants that are naturally green that are bred for like a purple or red foliage that gets I believe it's an anthocyanin in the leaves that is not tasteful to the pollinators. So those are the two main things that can easily or kind of are more in agreement that should be avoided. And then in terms of cultivar versus straight species, it kind of depends on the plant.
All right. Rudbeckia triloba, another Rudbeckia brown-eyed Susan. So this one's going to be a little bit on the taller side and it can flop if it's not supported. So plant it with some friends. You can still even plant this plant in a container with like some Schizacharium to help support it, and it'll do just fine. So prefers moist, well-drained soils, does like it a little bit on the wetter side, but it is drought tolerant once established. So once it's been in the ground for a while, shouldn't have any issues. It does self-seed a little bit. So again, if you have a client that's really sensitive to that, you can deadhead it. But again, Rudbeckia do attract some birds, so you'll be eliminating that positive attribute. But again, getting native plants in the landscape for pollinators is important. So if you do have to do a little deadheading, that is okay. It will sporadically bloom until frost. So I know here we say July, August. That's when you're going to see its heightened bloom, but we will see sporadic blooms all the way until frost. So again, a good nectar source for plants into the later season. This is a plant that provides nectar and pollen, although interestingly enough, this plant actually self-pollinates. So it doesn't really need the pollinators, but still adds really excellent benefits to the pollinator, giving them food. So it's also a larval host to silvery checker spots and attracts a lot of bees. So there's also a specialized bee just for Rudbeckia. It's the coneflower mining bee. That's the common name. Again, I'm like Shannon, just focusing on the plant names for Latin, even though I took Latin in college, but don't use it very often except for plants. But also attracts bumblebees, carpenter bees, and cuckoo bees. So again, powerhouse pollinator plant, Rudbeckia triloba, or brown-eyed Susan.
All right, so we have another goldenrod. Our goldenrod are kind of scattered throughout the PowerPoint here. So this is a Solidago cassia, or blue-stemmed goldenrod. And I think this is the only plant that we're talking about today that is more of a woodland species. So again, most of them are prairie species or kind of wet prairie species that are going to like full to part sun. This actually prefers partial shade to shade. So you're going to find it more in the particularly the upland woodlands, like deciduous oak forest is a common place for these. This we have listed in the ecoregion 8.3, which is the southeastern plains, so kind of southern Illinois and south and east. So its native range, kind of just the eastern edge of Illinois. Most counties there, it is shown to be native to, and then east of there. But it serves a really great purpose, again, being a plant that can tolerate some more shade than a lot of these others. It also is great in that it is a later season plant, so it supports those late season pollinators, particularly monarchs and painted ladies use the nectar. A wide variety of bees, wasps, and flies, the wavy lined emerald moth. There is a goldenrod gall moth, which forms galls on the stems, and then a lot of times different larvae will feed on those. It actually has 115 species of Lepidoptera, so moths and butterflies, that eat the leaves and shoots. And it also supports one of the highest numbers of natural enemies. So, like things like wasps and, bees and eat insects that we don't want on our plants sometimes, so aphids and things like that. So this plant is great and kind of it's supporting things that are taking care of maybe some of our other garden pests. The seeds on this are eaten by the indigo bunting, juncos, goldfinches, and other songbirds. This is one that deer will feed on the foliage. It's a little bit softer, so kind of more tasty to them. But overall, a great plant for supporting pollinators, not just in that 8.3 ecoregion. So Solidago cassia.
All right, another Solidago here. We have a few of them. Solidago nemoralis, or old field goldenrod. So this plant, pretty interesting, is one that goes into areas that have much poorer soils, actually, like the common name kind of explains that to us. So does really well in poor soils that are kind of nutrient deficient. So if you're dealing with a, site that, has that kind of situation. Moist, well-drained soils, but again, will become a little bit more drought tolerant once established. Like other goldenrods, a pollinator magnet, so long tongue bees like this one, short tongue bees, many types of wasps, flies, butterflies, and beetles, carpenter bees, plaster bees, love this one as well. So, and you can see that its ecoregion is also one that expands through many parts of the country. So this one definitely has a wider range, and with this one, because it can grow pretty much anywhere and you will see it pop up in areas that are disturbed or again have poor soil, it can get a little bit aggressive. So again, trying to maybe keep it on the drier side or deadhead does help control the plant a little bit more. So that's Solidago nemoralis, or old field goldenrod.
All right, so another goldenrod, and we're kind of out of alpha order here because this is one that sometimes you'll still see listed as Solidago, but the official name now is Oligoneuron rigidum, or stiff goldenrod. So the reclassification on this one came, the oligoneurums are more of the flat-headed goldenrod. So the solidagos are still going to be kind of, come to more of a point where these are more of an open top to them. So this is native to most of Illinois in north and west. So you can see this is a keystone in the temperate prairies area, so Iowa and kind of a little bit north and west of that. So it is common in dry prairies and adaptable to a wide range of soil moistures, although it does have the tendency to flop in soils that are too fertile or too wet. As you know, Nikki mentioned on the previous plant, kind of spreading and getting aggressive. This is one that can be a prolific seeder. So it's all about balance, right? And what situation you're using it in. So obviously we want to be leaving the seeds for, wildlife support where we can. But if it's in a more of a garden setting, we might want to, be cutting a portion of it back at least to help cut down on seeding where you may not want things to be going. So I need to use a thoughtful approach on some of these plants. So this is one that attracts monarchs as well as bees, wasps, flies, and beetles. There are 43 specialist bees that use this plant, and larvae of several types of moths feed on various parts. So the black blister gall midge, the twirler moth. This, I had mentioned the goldenrod gall on Solidago acacia. So that lays forms its gall on the stems, and larvae, the larvae that are in that gall there provide protein for woodpeckers and chickadees. So again, Nikki mentioned at the beginning how, a lot of these birds are using, caterpillar larvae as their main source of protein. So very important there. In terms of birds, the greater prairie chicken and the goldfinch will eat the seeds, and deer, rabbits, and muskrats will eat the foliage, particularly when it's a young plant, when it's going to be a little bit softer. So in some cases with these plants, you'll see, mammals go for the foliage more when it's fresh spring shoots that are soft, and may stay away from it a little bit more as the plant matures and the foliage gets a little bit tougher. So this is a Oligoneuron rigidum.
All right, now we're going to get into some asters. So now we're going to transition a little away from yellow, more into our purple and blue colors. So Symphyr trichum, ericoides, or heath aster. So this one, again, like most asters, what we're looking at is that late season flowering, which is really important, especially for monarchs. Most of the asters we're going to talk about are really important for monarch butterflies to make their way, back down to Mexico. So this one is going to like it on the drier side. Of course, with that, it does can handle drought just fine. It spreads by rhizomes and can seed a little bit, but again, not very aggressive, so stays pretty well behaved. It's a really nice size, 18 to 24 inches tall. We have this one planted at Natural Garden in our kind of like residential landscape. So good size for more of a residential kind of situation. This plant is also the host for the pearl crest butterfly, and I love birds. So this was one of the only plants that I saw was actually a food source for wild turkeys. So they actually like the foliage and they like the seeds. So and then also this one is a special value to native bees, and in particular, the rusty patch bumblebee really like this plant, so which is important pollinator. So that one is Symphyiotrichum ericoides or heath aster.
All right, then we have Symphyiotrichum levy or smooth blue aster. So its name kind of alludes to the foliage, and the stems are a little bit smoother than a lot of asters that tend to be more hairy or rough. So that that smoothness does make it a little more attractive to mammals like deer, rabbits, and groundhogs, who, again, especially the young foliage, they may do some browsing there. So this is a plant that is typically found in higher quality natural areas, a little bit bigger than ericoides that Nikki just talked about at 3 to 4 feet tall. Again, a late season bloomer that's going to provide important, nectar for butterflies that time of year. So it has that dainty flower, and the dry seed is typically carried by the wind. So this is another one, depending on how much spreading you want, you may want to do a little bit of deadheading to help control some of that. So the nectar and pollen attract many types of bees, including honeybees, bumblebees, cuckoo bees, sticker bees, and leaf cutters. Insects and moths feed on various parts, including the wavy lined emerald moth and the asteroid moth. As Nikki, similarly to the Aster ericoides, it's a host for silvery checker spot and the pearl crescent butterfly. And ruffled grouse and wild turkeys feed on both the leaves and the seeds of this plant. So this is Symphyiotrichum levy.
All right, we had a quick question on Solidago nemoralis. It does spread by rhizomes and it also does seed, but it's not a very prolific seeder. So mostly you're going to see it spread by runners. So, all right. Symphyiotrichum laterifolium or side flowering aster, or you might also see this one actually called calico aster, which I think is because of the kind of color variation you see there on the flower, which is pretty cool. So this one can get a little bit taller than some of the other plants, 24 to 36 inches, but still not, huge for a residential landscape. This one tends to be, you can see it there on the Keystone ecoregions, tends to like a woodland edge. So if you see it in natural areas, you're very rarely going to see it actually out in a full sun prairie. So it does tend to be more on a woodland edge with dappled shade. It likes soils a little bit more on the moist side. Again, that kind of goes along with it being, more on that woodland edge area. And like most asters, it's not going to be deer or rabbit resistant, which is okay. Especially with like rabbits, it kind of can be nice with asters where they'll come in the spring and do a little prune for you and keep the plants more compact. So we rarely ever see that they completely decimate them, but they'll give it a nice prune to keep that size more in check with what most people want in a residential landscape. So it can also handle some clay. So good again for a lot of the residential situations around here. And then it does attract a large number of native bees. And what's kind of cool about this flower structure is it has really short nectar tubes, which makes the nectar really accessible to both the short tongue and long tongue bees. So Symphony trichum laterifolium or side flowering aster.
Okay, and then our last aster, Symphytrichum novae anglii or New England aster. So this is very common throughout most of the Midwest. So Illinois, Wisconsin, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, native to all of those areas. So this is a plant that tolerates clay pretty well, which I know particularly in Illinois is always a question. It can be stressed a bit by hot, dry weather. So you can see that it's pretty big at 3 to 4 feet tall. So sometimes it will, as asters can do, kind of lose that lower foliage if it's stressed. I have this planted at my house and it kind of, especially in the dry weather we had last year, really flopped open quite a bit. So good to kind of plant it with some other things that might help hold it up. But as Nikki said, a lot of times the asters, I watched a rabbit a year or two ago just take this plant down in spring in my yard, like 12-inch sections of it. So it just does a little bit of pruning for you. But again, this supports a wide variety of pollinators, including monarchs, so a variety of bees, skippers and flies, and many moths will eat it during the larval stage, including the Gorgon checker spot, the pearl crescent, and the northern flower moth. Cross-pollination is very important for this plant or else the seed will be sterile. So, and then the seeds, it can be eaten by typically wild turkeys on this one. So this is Symphytrichum novae anglii.
All right, last plant, Vernonia fasciculata or common ironweed. So I was excited to see this one on here, give us a little bit of variety. So this one also is going to be a little bit on the taller side, 3 to 4 feet tall. Prefers moist, well-drained soils. Actually, this is another one that loves a wetter, full sun situation. So if that's where it's planted, it might actually get a little bit aggressive. So if you have a drier soil situation, that'll help keep the plant in check a little bit better. This one is also special value to native bees, so it hosts a very wide variety of different bee species. It's also the host for the American painted lady. Butterflies love it. We've seen on this plant, because we have some planted at Natural Garden in the landscape, butterflies will absolutely just love this plant in the midsummer. And this is one where if you have a customer who likes it, wants it in the landscape, but is a little bit worried about the height, you can give it that Chelsea chop, if you've ever heard that, or which is basically just prune it down to maybe like 6 inches in late spring. The plant will reflush, it won't hurt the flowering or anything. You'll just have a more compact plant. This one does self-seed just a little bit more than other plants. So again, if you don't want that, you can go ahead and prune off the flower heads. So this one is Vernonia fasciculata or common ironweed.
All right, and so then we just wanted to highlight or talk about trees and shrubs for a moment. Like I mentioned, if you go to the Homegrown National Park site for each of the ecoregions, they'll have 2 lists, the container list, which is kind of what we were covering, and then a trees and shrubs list. So we in our sales yard typically have trees provided by Doty Nursery, which is balled and burlapped, and then also Kankakee. And Kankakee, particularly in the last couple of years, has started carrying more native species in a 15-gallon or number 15 root pouch. So if that is something that you're interested in, either stop by the yard or talk to our staff when you're there. Or contact either of those nurseries directly. And of course, there are lots of other nurseries too. But if you're looking for more information on Keystone trees and shrubs, that can be found on the Homegrown National Park website. So then for that is kind of it, unless there are any further questions, although I think we're pretty much out of time. So thank you for joining us today. You can stay in touch with us via our social media, our Instagram page. Again, as Jamie mentioned at the beginning, this webinar will be posted on our YouTube page within the next couple of weeks. And then there's also the information for Homegrown National Park. So you can follow them on Instagram or Facebook, or go to their website and access a lot of the resources they have there. So thank you all for joining us. I hope, everyone learned something and you can kind of speak more confidently to your customers about Keystone plants and their importance, and start incorporating them into your designs. So
Thanks, everybody.
have a good one.